welcome everyone on Zoom. So we're going to have an opportunity for questions at the end. So please feel free to post them in the chat and we'll get to them. I'm going to speak for, a little over half an hour and cover some of the areas, but it's a very interesting and novel area of the law. So you might have a specific interest. I'm going to try to cover it kind of broadly, but if you have questions that you want to dig a little deeper into one area or another, please feel free to pose them, and I will get to them at the end, I promise. So yeah, this is a very interesting area, and those of us that practice with a focus on fertility law usually sort of stumbled into it by accident, and I sort of got into it from working a lot in the LGBT community, where the use of third-party reproduction to have children is fairly commonplace. But it's also an area that's growing, with women delaying their children until later in life, which has posed some fertility challenges. And I also kind of always wanted to be a doctor, so it's an opportunity for me to also delve into a little bit of medical terminology. So I'm going to go over some of that with all of you, because it's really changed in the 25 plus years that I've been practicing. Things have really changed medically in terms of advances in fertility, which has the law had to legally had to catch up with, and is still trying to do so. But I'm going to talk about the latest developments, particularly in Ontario. So in terms of key concepts, there's sort of two areas of the law that you have to be aware of. There's federal legislation, and that governs some of the issues in assisted reproduction. It's called the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, okay? And that's the federal legislation. And then parentage, and who's a parent and who has to pay child support and who has parental obligations, that's governed province by province. So I'm going to be talking about Ontario here today, but there is different legislation in all of the provinces. Just in terms of what third-party reproduction is, what we're talking about is when you need someone else to assist you in forming your family. So it could be surrogacy, when the person who carries the child is not the intended mother. It could be gamete donation, which is the donation of either sperm or ova, or it could be embryo donation, when embryos have already been made with sperm and ova and you're donating your embryos to someone else. So the Assisted Human Reproduction Act federally sort of governs how third parties should be regulated. And essentially what it is it says that all of these things are perfectly legal to do in Canada, but they have to be done altruistically. In other words, you can't pay someone consideration to be a surrogate. You can't pay someone for their embryos that they have in storage, if they had stored embryos, or pay someone for their sperm or ova. Instead, you can only pay reasonable expenses that with receipts. Okay, so this legislation came into place in about 2004. So I was practicing both before and after the legislation, but because it came into effect in 2004, what happened was, for instance, you could no longer pay sperm donors to donate sperm. So what happened was that for the most part, Canadian sperm banks closed because they couldn't attract enough donors without paying for the donation. So most couples now that need couples or singles or anyone that wants to use third-party reproduction that requires sperm has to go frequently to the US to have sperm imported from a US sperm bank. Okay, surrogates can be paid for expenses, receivable expenses over the pregnancy, and I'm going to talk about what goes into a surrogacy agreement. If you actually because it's prohibited to pay for expenses, if you pay beyond expenses, you could be guilty of a crime, and it's punishable with up to 10 years in jail and a $500,000 fine. So very serious criminal consequences for any of the prohibited activities in the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. So that's something to bear in mind. So in terms of gamete donation, there's sperm and ova donation, and then also embryo donation are the three main areas. And in terms of the donors in this area, there's sort of three groups or classes of donors. Sometimes they're known, okay? Because it's hard to find a donor that will act altruistically. Frequently now, a lot of people are looking to family members to donate ova, for instance, or friends or acquaintances, because you need someone that's willing to do that without being paid, and it's not an insignificant to get to go through an ova donation cycle. There are open identity donors, so there are donors that you can arrange who will agree that upon a child becoming 18 that the child can know their identity. And then there's anonymous. But to be honest, with all the DNA testing and whatnot that we do at this point, anonymous donation is becoming a thing of the past. There are registries online where children, donor offspring who have been conceived with donor sperm or ova are able to connect with each other, try to find their genetic parents. So that's increasingly becoming not a guarantee, even if you do purchase sperm from a sperm bank that is anonymous in nature. Surrogacy, there's sort of two types of surrogacy, and traditional is when the surrogate is also the egg donor, or it is her ova that are being used. Okay, so traditional is sort of that common situation. That's not something that legally I would ever recommend to intended parents. Most of the work that I would do would be, and most of what we'll be talking about today, is gestational surrogacy, which is where the surrogate is not genetically related to the child. The baby would have been born through in vitro fertilization with either the intended parent's genetic material or donor genetic material, but not the gestational carrier. And interestingly, this fun fact, surrogacy has increased by 400% in the last decade from the stats that we know. Those are stats that are compiled by a society that regulates fertility professionals, so that it is a very growing area. And the reasons for the increased use of surrogacy is twofold. 16% of Canadian couples have experienced infertility, and there are many gay couples and single men that are using surrogates as well as the general fertility population, with women having medical issues related primarily to the delay of the decision to have a family. So in terms of fertility law terms, because you'll hear me say some of this, we have all these acronyms. So the GC is the gestational carrier. Okay, that's what I'm going to be talking about. TS for the traditional surrogate. IPs are the intended parents, intended mother, intended father. GM, GF, the genetic parents, and the donor. Okay. So this is where you get your little medical lesson. So one fertility procedure that is frequently used for donor sperm is intrauterine insemination, and that is when a procedure where the sperm is put directly inside the intended mother, and it's there are some risks to it depending, but it's not as effective as this IVF, which I'm going to talk about next, but it's often used by lesbian mothers, trans couples, etc., or straight couples with a male factor infertility that are using donor sperm, and it can be done at a physician's office, or in some cases it can be done at home. In vitro fertilization is when the sperm and egg are united outside of a uterus, and then at a certain stage the blastocyst is transferred to either the intended mother or the gestational carrier, and it really increases the the rates of fertility. It's also used where there's male factor infertility, because the sperm, through a process called ICSI, can be implanted in the like sort of inserted right into the ova, and selective sperm can be planted. So if some sperm are good and some are bad, the good ones can be picked under a microscope and used to form the embryo. And so again, this is used by many couples, and I know that this is an area of private medicine. It's very expensive, but IVF procedure can be paid for. One full cycle can be paid for by the Ontario government now in Ontario. So this is an area where there is some funding, although sometimes there are waiting lists and difficulties in getting that cycle. You can have one cycle of retrieval of ova, and the embryos formed and the transfers back associated with the IVF. Now, this is an area that has a lot of psychological issues, I guess I would say, and it is very routine, in fact, almost required in most clinics, that if you're going to be using any kind of third party, that you be psychologically screened, and that also the donor or the surrogate also be screened prior to being able to access medical treatment. So this slide sort of lists what some of the issues are, and they really vary depending on the reason for the need for third-party reproduction. So for instance, in the LGBTQ area, the use of third parties isn't usually associated with trauma or loss or infertility per se. So, so there's different sort of issues that the IPs might have. There's psychological issues for surrogates, making sure that the surrogate is protected and not that there's no power imbalance in the negotiations. And there's psychological issues for both egg and sperm donors. And lastly, there's the psychological issues for offspring. And because this is a newer area of medicine, we're only starting the first sort of comprehensive studies to look at how the use of third-party reproduction is impacting on the children who were conceived through third parties. And we're not sure that it's going to be the same, for instance, as children who were adopted, etc., because it's very different psychologically different issues associated with that. But it's something to that the first studies are starting to come out about and to consider. So I want to talk a little bit about what goes into these legal agreements that we do around surrogacy and gamete donation, because they're complicated. So a surrogacy agreement is negotiated between the surrogate and the intended parents, and the surrogate needs to have her own lawyer. Okay, and for a variety of reasons, that's really important later on when the child is born. In terms of parentage, and I'll come to that in a minute in terms of what happens in Ontario. But the agreement's like it's like a 40-page document, and it covers a huge amount of issues. I'm just going to list some of them for you. So first off, it would talk about how many embryos would be transferred at a time. Typically now that's one, okay? And in fact, that in order to get funding under that from the Ontario government, there can only be one transfer. This is to reduce the chance of a multiple pregnancy, a multiple birth, which is riskier. So typically it's one, although sometimes it can be more than one, particularly if the physician feels that the embryos are of poorer quality, okay? The agreement deals with what happens if the embryos split. For some reason, and I don't think the scientists know yet, but it's more common in an IVF cycle for an embryo to split than it is in a otherwise, and we're not really sure why that is, but there has to be a provision about what happens if it is a multiple birth. Will the surrogate, for instance, agree to selectively reduce? What is the plan if the surrogate, who has her own family and is working, has a complicated pregnancy? Maybe she didn't have it for her own children, but maybe she is. What if she's required to be on bed rest? Will the intended parents pay and support her while she's off of work or top her up from any medical leave? So those kinds of expenses are considered. So abortion, selective reduction, medical testing, will she agree to undergo an amnio? What kind of medical care is she going to have? Is there going to be a midwife, a doula? Will it be a hospital birth or a home birth? Things about travel and food restrictions, not eating unpasteurized cheeses, for instance, and that kind of thing. I've seen those things in agreements. Confidentiality, like who's going to be told? We know now that it's very important for children to know the circumstances surrounding their conception and birth, and secrets aren't good. There are studies that have demonstrated that. But perhaps it's going to be confidential within the family for a certain period of time, or you certainly don't want a book written about it, or etc. What's the future relationship going to look like between the surrogate and the child? What would happen if both of the parents died? There needs to be a provision for a guardian, or if they divorce and the surrogate gives birth, she needs to know where the child should go. And then lastly, there's significant expenses associated with a surrogacy, and how much are those expenses that the surrogate can incur? What will be reimbursed? What kinds of things will be reimbursed? So under the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, there are regulations now that talk about the categories of expenses, the kinds of things that can be paid for, like maternity clothing, for instance, expenses that are reasonably associated with a pregnancy and birth. And the draft regulation talks about loss of work-related income for a surrogate, but requires that it be that a physician says that continuing to work would pose a danger to either her or the fetus. Okay. Typically we agree on maximums and how they'll be paid over the pre-pregnancy, during the pregnancy, and post-pregnancy period. Okay, what the kinds of things that go into a sperm or ova donor agreement? Talk about the obligations, typically the medical screening, so the donor indicating that for instance, a sperm donor indicating that he has been properly screened. It'll talk about the clinic location, how many times, whether there'll be no child support obligation on the donor, whether the donor is going to be, one of those types. Is it going to be anonymous or identity release or open? Confirmation that the donor's not a parent, and then sort of waivers and releases around all parental rights and obligations. So that's sort of the federal scheme and how we contract those kinds of arrangements. This is happy family law. This is about forming families, not dissolving families. And so it's a very nice area to practice in. There's lots of babies. I love babies. So it's a lot of happiness, but it requires a lot of planning, and it can be costly legally, so it can be prohibitive. So let me go on now to talk about what happens after this family is formed and the baby is born. And I'm going to talk about that in Ontario. And I realize that this slide's a little old because it says that it's new, but it's not so new anymore. It's 2017 that this legislation came in. But the legislation came as a result of a challenge by a number of families who wanted the Children's Law Reform Act, which hadn't been updated since the 70s, to really reflect families as they function, not families based on natural reproduction or adoption only. Basically, a very child-centered best interest approach, because we know now that there are many different kinds of families. And I put this slide up here to show, like, you might have a genetic parent that isn't parenting you. You might have a social parent that is, and so the Children's Law Reform Act really takes a functional approach to look at who are the intended parents and who are actually parenting a child, and to give them the legal authority to make decisions in the child's best interest. So it was called the All Families Are Equals Act, and it was enacted by the Ontario government in response to this court challenge and the court ordering the government to update the legislation, which hadn't been updated, as you can see here, since 1978, and hadn't kept up to pace with LGBTQ families and hadn't kept up to pace with medical and assisted reproduction generally. So the legislation talks about who is a parent and who isn't a parent, and circumstances in which you can go to court to be declared a parent if it's not clear for some reason. And so it's very interesting because it takes away any language around gender. So it talks of it's trans friendly. So a birth parent doesn't have to be a mother, okay? It can be a trans man that has a uterus that can deliver. So it's not cisnormative, it's trans friendly. So you'll see that a birth parent, unless that is a surrogate, okay, is a parent. Okay, so is a parent. And the definition of a birth parent is the person who gives birth and is no longer gender defined, which means that that person no longer has to be in the mother section of a birth certificate. I'm going to show you what a birth certificate looks like, a new birth certificate looks like in a moment. Interestingly, a person who provides sperm through sex, okay, is a parent, but there's now an exception, and you can actually donate sperm through sex, but you have to have a written preconception donor agreement, and then you're not going to be a parent to the child. So that's quite interesting, because I'm not sure of any other jurisdiction in the world that has this provision, but this is because some families do have a donor who's not going to be a parent but donate through sexual intercourse for a variety of reasons. But otherwise, there's a presumption that a child conceived through sex is a parent in the circumstances listed there, so spousal, etc. It's important to know, though, that regardless of what happens, you will always become a parent or cross over into the parent category if you've been treating a child like a child of your own, if you've shown a settled intention to parent a child. That can mean that you have both financial obligations to that child and that you have rights of parenting time, or in some cases, decision making. So even if you're not a parent, you can become a parent under this, and Section 5 of the Child Support Guidelines would apply to you, and you would have to pay child support in accordance with that section if the child wasn't living with you. Okay, so then the Children's Law Reform Act goes on to talk about who's not a parent. And this is very helpful because it's been a disincentive until this legislation for sperm donors to donate, or for ova donors to donate, because there was a concern that they might be held responsible for financial consequences and have a child support obligation. But now under this legislation, it says very clearly that a donor is not a parent. Again, though, remember I talked about that settled intention. If that donor starts acting like a parent, seeing the child regularly, financially providing for the child's calling considers the donor a parent, you could cross over the line. But as a starting point, just by reason of donation alone, you're not a parent. Similarly, a surrogate, now it's very clear, is not a parent. Okay, but there's certain conditions that have to be met for the birth to be registered, okay, after birth. So it can be registered after birth once the child is 7 days old if everyone agrees, okay? But there has to have been a valid surrogacy agreement where everyone had independent legal advice that was signed before the transfer, the IVF transfer. So in this circumstance, it's very important that everyone get lawyers and have a surrogacy agreement signed properly before any transfers of embryos take place. This part of the legislation actually applies also to traditional surrogates. Even a traditional surrogacy where the surrogate is also the genetic mother, there still needs to be a surrogacy agreement signed with everyone having their own lawyer before the surrogate gets pregnant. In some circumstances, you need to go to court to get an order declaring you to be a parent. This can be important for couples traveling from overseas that are pursuing a surrogacy journey in Canada. They might need an actual court order that a child is theirs. It might not be good enough to just be able to register the birth. Frequently, even in surrogacy, as long as you've done this agreement, you don't need to go to court to get a court order. You can simply file the birth certificate with the requisite consents, okay, that have to be sworn before a lawyer or a notary, so some notarized consents, and the birth can be registered. And we can have up to 4 people named as parents without a court order on the birth. So as long as certain conditions are made, and the really important one is preconception intention. You can't just add parents along the way. There has to be evidence of preconception intention for you to get an order declaring parentage. So there could be even more than 4 parents, but you have to satisfy those conditions. And so I'm going to show you what my final slide, which shows you what a birth certificate looks like now. And there are 2 different birth certificates, really. A third one for children that are adopted, but for otherwise now, you can have up to 4, and this is one that shows 4, but frequently you can use the one that just has 2 parents. And you see that the parents aren't identified in a specific section. You get to choose. It's like a drop-down menu, whether to identify yourself as mother, father, or parent. And you can have up to 4 provided there's so that would frequently be people are going to say, well, how many 4-parent families are there? Well, oftentimes in assisted reproduction, you might have, for instance, a gay male couple and a lesbian couple. That would be the most frequent, who have decided to join forces to have a child together with genetic material from 2 of the couple, for instance. So that would be the most common 4-parent family. So things have changed a lot since 1978, and we finally have the most progressive legislation in the world on assisted reproduction, I would say. I really suggest that it's the work of our Canadian judges that have been holding governments accountable to bring parentage law in line with the current state of our families and with what's best for our children. And that has led to legislative reform. There's progressive legislation also in BC and Alberta, and some of the other prairie provinces are having some advances. You'd have to consult a lawyer if you were using assisted reproduction in that jurisdiction, or that's knowledgeable about the jurisdiction where you would be using assisted reproduction. So those are my preliminary comments. I'm open to questions or to dive deeper into any areas where people might have questions or concerns or particular situations they want to ask me about. I'm also available privately. You can Google me and email me, and I'm happy to. Sometimes these are issues that are private in nature, and I'm also happy to answer them offline if that helps.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I learned so much today. I mean, I was thinking about the 4-parent families. I was trying in my head to figure out how are they so, how common would they be? So it was very interesting to learn that they are quite common, and the reason they are quite common. So that was interesting. And I did not know that Ontario's legislation was so progressive. So it
Yes,
was
it's quite
very,
progressive. And you
yes.
know what's interesting, Andrew? You know how I talked about how you can donate sperm through sex and not be a parent? When they put that in the legislation, that surprised me too. I was like, when does this happen? But I realized after that that it happened much more frequently than I thought, because now when I do a donor agreement, I always have to say what is the method of conception? It's going to be assisted reproduction or sexual intercourse. And surprisingly, um, more couples than you think do accept donation through sexual intercourse. That might be because they're bisexual, for instance, in a lesbian, in a two-woman intended mother situation, or it might be because they have feelings that like a live donation like that is more likely to result in a pregnancy. But it's actually more common than I would have thought too, even though I've been doing this for a few decades. Yeah.
Wow, yes, that's very interesting to learn. I did not know that. Yes, and I had another question. So, given that we're so progressive, do we have a lot of foreigners coming to
Yes.
Ontario?
Yes, we have. So we are what I would call a reproductive tourism destination for many couples around the world for two reasons. Well, no, for three reasons really. One, um, because surrogacy is perfectly legal. It's not legal in many countries like France, a lot of Central European countries. Surrogacy is illegal. So those couples will come to Canada. The second reason they'll come is that we are very gay friendly. So gay men that, for instance, would have a difficult time pursuing parenting, forming a family in Italy or whatever, will commonly come to Canada because we're very friendly to equal marriage, etc. And then lastly, of course, we have the surrogates' medical costs are covered by OHIP, for instance. Now, the babies wouldn't be because the baby's not an Ontario resident. So, couples that travel to Canada to pursue surrogacy have to, have to be concerned about making sure they have made medical insurance arrangements for a child, just in case the child had significant health issues, because they could be prohibitively expensive. But the surrogate having medical coverage through her pregnancy and really good medical care across Canada is also makes us very friendly. So for all of those reasons, many people do come. The challenge here for us is that because it's only altruistic, it can be very difficult to find someone to act as a surrogate for you if you don't have a family member or friend, because obviously for those of us that have been pregnant, it's not an easy job, right? It's not something that you would do lightly. It's a significant commitment over, a year-long period between all of the medical appointments and the transfers and the so it can be very challenging to find someone to act as your surrogate. So that is the challenge about our altruistic nature.
Yep, I can certainly see that. And what was interesting to learn, I know that you mentioned about the government funding one cycle. Do you know if there's any movement towards having that expanded or?
No, I doubt it. But you got to remember, though, that one cycle, including the retrieval of the embryos, if you were using an egg donor or if the intended mother has healthy ova, will result in multiple embryos. And so that cycle includes transferring all of those embryos. So it actually could result in more than one transfer because it might not be successful. So it includes the transfers associated with the retrieval. So it's sort of like when I say one cycle, it's kind of, I'm misspeaking really. It's one retrieval and then the transfers associated with that retrieval.
So if it isn't successful
And you
once,
still
they
have
can try again.
embryos, you can try
And
again.
that is covered.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's really good to know. Yes, I
Yes.
wasn't aware of that.
Some restrictions on it being single transfer of embryos, though. Yeah. Can't
Okay.
transfer two at a time or anything like that.
Yeah.
And you have to find out where you are. There are only so many cycles per year available, etc. So that you'd have to consult with your healthcare provider, your fertility physician about the availability. But certainly many of my clients are making use of that because the legal fees associated with some of the other things like the surrogacy agreement or the donor agreement or both in many cases, are significant cost and are not subject to any kind of funding or coverage.
Right. That's a good point you make. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. So it, people have to be thinking about those additional costs.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And do you have any idea of the ballpark for say, a
Oh yeah, I can.
standard?
Yeah, so I mean, remember, you need lawyers on both sides. So typically, a surrogacy agreement would cost $3,500 to $4,000 for the parents, and then they would also pay the surrogates expenses associated with the contract, which would be about half that.
Okay.
And in a donor agreement situation, the donor agreement would probably be about $2,500 for the intended parent and about half that for the donor, typically because the intended parents are the ones that do the lion's share of the work and the drafting. And we try to keep the costs down because we love doing this area of the law, but it is not an uncomplicated area. Like I said, the surrogacy agreements are very lengthy and require a lot of discussion and consideration. Then there's the psychological, testing, etc. Then there's the medical costs if they're not covered on a government cycle, etc. So these are expensive things, and um, people go into debt to sort of pursue this area. Yes.
Yes. I can see that. Yes. So if there are no more questions, I would ask everybody to fill out the survey. And I wanted to thank Kelly again for taking time out this afternoon on such a busy September day, because I know how busy she is. And really appreciate you taking the time, Kelly, to speak to us this afternoon. I'm sure people have questions, but as you noted earlier, it's a very private area. And oh, we do have one question here from Anna Maria. How common is surrogacy in Canada compared to other births?
We don't know exactly. We just know that it's increased significantly. So, for a while, when they were amending the legislation in Ontario, they were going to try to track how many births are surrogacy births. The data that we do have is more compiled through fertility physicians talking about the number of surrogacy births that they do. Um, I would say that, and I don't know how many, I don't know the stats about how many kids are born not through surrogacy, but for sure through surrogacy births in Ontario, like per month, is going to be, mm, you know, 50 to 100 maybe per month or something like that. That's my best guess just about my knowledge. So that's anecdotal, but that's probably so I don't know how many other births there are, but that's how much I would guess just knowing how much work there is in this area. And Ontario is a major area. We have a lot of fertility clinics, so there's a lot of support here. Until the last 10 years, for instance, in Alberta, they didn't have major fertility centers. So, things have changed significantly, but yes, so that's my best guess.
Thank you so much. And I also wanted to thank Kenny Ann and Ferdinand for doing all the background on organizing today's webinar. And thank you everybody for joining us today. It was really helpful having you. And I know this is a very private area of the law. And Kelly has kindly offered to assist anybody who has questions. And as she said, you can Google her, find her website. It's easy, Kelly Gordon, so family law. And thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you taking your time. And also, Kelly, again, thank you so much.
Thanks
And
for having me,
remember,
Jim.
we will be posting this webinar on our website so you can view it later. Tell anybody else who might have missed today, and they'll be able to view it later.